In the shadows of loss, grief, and longing, something always reaches back. These are three tales of bonds that stretch beyond life and reason. If you enjoy wandering through the archive, a quick like or subscribe helps us bring you more stories from the shadows. Thank you. Now settle in, close your eyes, and let your mind wander. We'll guide you through the dark. This story comes from a post shared on an obscure internet forum. The poster, a young woman, was asking for help with something she called the companion. The poster described herself as a 17-year-old high school student. Her life, by her account, had recently spiraled into a series of isolating events. She'd been the target of bullying at school. Her parents were fighting constantly, and the tension at home drove her to retreat to her room most nights. There she would withdraw, scrolling mindlessly on her phone, searching for distractions that never really came. It was during one of these nights that she first noticed the companion. She was lying in bed, staring at her screen, when she heard a faint noise at her window. At first, she thought it was just a moth hitting the glass, drawn to the light in her room. But when she looked up, she noticed a strange black smudge on the window. She described the smudge as looking like someone had used their hand to smear a thin layer of chocolate syrup on the outside of the glass. She assumed maybe her dad had washed the windows poorly and dismissed it. Each night, she continued her doom scrolling, waiting for the bliss of unconsciousness to end another day, filled with torment at school and isolation at home. Each night she heard the sound again, a soft bump, a faint squeak of glass. The sounds were so subtle it would take her a moment to consciously recognize them. By the time she looked, there was nothing there. But she thought that the smudges looked different each time. She reasoned it must be the weather altering the grime on the glass, or her imagination. But one night, curiosity overcame her. After she recognized that she had heard the sound, she moved cautiously to the window to see if anything was there. At the edge of her yard, near the line of trees that bordered the woods, she thought she saw a flash of pink duck behind a tree. It was so quick she thought she must have imagined it. No animal or stalker would skulk in pink, she thought, so she assumed it was her imagination. Still, the sight unsettled her, and she double-checked the locks on her window. The next night, after registering that she had heard the sound again, she turned to her window to see something that she could not explain away as her imagination. A crude drawing of a flower had been smeared in the grime in the corner of her window, as if by a finger. The stem was adorned with 2 simple leaves and topped with 5 petals. She moved carefully to the window and peeked outside. At first, she saw nothing. But then, from behind the same tree that she had thought she saw something duck behind the night before, something peeked out. Before describing what she saw, the poster writes, "Please don't laugh. I know it sounds ridiculous, but I swear, this is what I saw." A gloved hand emerged from behind the tree, oversized, grimy, and white. Then came the head. It had the shape of a rabbit, but its fur was faded pink. Its large plastic eyes gleamed unnaturally, and a permanent grin revealed broad plastic teeth, too perfect and polished to be real. It looked like someone wearing a mascot costume, or maybe a costume from a kid's restaurant, but she had never seen anything like it before. She should have screamed, called her parents, anything. Instead, she froze, watching as the thing raised its gloved hand and waved. Slowly, deliberately. She remembered nothing after that. She woke the next morning, convinced it had been a dream. But when she looked at the window, the bottom was filled with more crudely drawn flowers, and above them was a single word, "Help," punctuated with a question mark. Initially, she thought the creature might be asking for help, as if someone were trapped inside a cheesy bunny suit. But then, why her? Why not the police? As the loneliness of her day pressed down on her, another thought began to take hold. Perhaps it wasn't asking for help. Perhaps it was offering it. That night, the rain came. After another miserable day at school and an argument with her parents, she returned to her room to find the flowers washed away by the rain. That's when she realized that deep inside, she had started to feel a connection to this strange visitor. The loneliness inside overcame her, and she wound up crying herself to sleep. Later that night, she was awakened by a gentle thump at her window, followed by a wet squeak against the glass. She looked up and found the pink figure staring at her through the window. The rain matted its fur and caused its pink ears to sag, giving it a melancholy air, despite the wide plastic grin frozen on its polyester face. Its gloved hand dragged a finger slowly along the glass, drawing shapes and letters that blurred in the rain. She moved closer, trying to make sense of them. She wasn't scared, not even curious anymore. She felt something deeper, more desperate. Maybe they really could help each other. The companion's finger traced words on the glass. Not alone. Help you. Help me. Its movements were jerky, unnatural. When she reached the window, the creature stopped. It pressed the palm of its gloved hand to the glass, empty eyes locking onto hers. She hesitated, but felt an aching pull in her chest. Slowly, she raised her hand and pressed it to the glass. The gloved hand slid down, and she allowed her hand to follow. Rain had started seeping through the sill of the window into a dark pool. Once her finger touched the wooden sill, she realized the liquid seeping in wasn't rain. It was somehow colder and slicker. To her shock, the liquid lunged at her hand, striking like a serpent. Before she could react, it pierced the skin of her palm. The cold, viscous oil slid into the wound, spreading under her flesh. As she jerked her hand back, so did the figure outside. As it did, she thought she saw a tendril of black ooze retreat into the cuff of the gloved hand. She stumbled back, clutching her hand. When she looked back, the companion was gone. And then, for the first time, she heard it. A voice, soft and invasive, whispering in her mind, "Now we are not alone." She stared at her hand. The dark liquid filled the hole in her palm and took on the shape of her skin. In place of a wound was a faint, almost imperceptible dark mark. The voice continued, wrapping her thoughts in barbed reassurances. "They don't need you. They don't want you. But I do." The user ends her story by saying the voice whispered to her all night, weaving cruel truths with strange reassurances. And when the sun rose, she opened her phone and started typing her post, asking for help. There were a few responders, asking follow-up questions or offering advice. Most of them urged her to seek emotional or spiritual help. She never responded to any of the replies. The following account originates from a winter ledger kept by Mr. Elias Hargrave, clerk of a remote village whose name and location have since been lost to time. His entries detail the events of a brutal winter, though one record stands apart. A cautionary tale, meticulously documented. Hargrave's words suggest he intended it as a warning for future residents to heed the traditions surrounding the Lantern Keeper. The tragedy began the prior winter when Mrs. Agatha Bray, a widow of 38, lost her only son, Thomas, in a freak accident. Agatha and Thomas were newcomers to the settlement, having moved there after her husband's death in search of a stable life and opportunity for her son. However, that opportunity was never realized. A heavy storm had clogged the Bray hearth with snow and debris. In his eagerness to restore warmth, Thomas climbed onto the roof to clear the blockage. He slipped on the ice, falling headfirst into the narrow flue. The force broke his neck. He died instantly. The village rallied to recover Thomas's body. They worked in grim silence, eventually delivering the young man to his grieving mother. Thomas was given a proper burial, and though Agatha attended the funeral with her customary dignity, it was clear the loss had hollowed her. As was tradition in the village, each winter brought the arrival of a stranger, known only as the lantern keeper. Dressed in a heavy coat and hat that obscured his face, he carried with him a collection of lanterns crafted from thick glass and iron. For a modest offering, the lantern keeper would light one for each household, placing it by the doorway or in the nearest tree. It was said these lanterns kept the spirits of the dead at bay, ensuring peace through the dark months. Agatha, however, refused the lantern keeper's service. Mrs. Clarissa Hodge, a neighbor passing by the Bray home, later recounted overhearing the exchange. She described Agatha standing firmly in her doorway, questioning the lantern keeper as to why anybody would want to keep their loved ones away. What passed between them beyond this was not recorded in detail, save for the lantern keeper's final ominous warning. They are not the same when they come back. Agatha shut the door, and the lantern keeper moved on. His lanterns illuminated the rest of the village, casting faint halos through the endless snow. In the weeks that followed, villagers began to notice signs of Agatha's decline. Smoke never rose from her chimney, though she was seen at church, gaunt and shivering. Concerned, Mrs. Harriet Hargrave, the clerk's wife, decided to visit. Harriet found the Bray home colder than the air outside. Frost coated the inside of the windows, and the smell of soot lingered like a ghost in the dim light. Agatha sat by the empty hearth, clutching her shawl tightly, her lips cracked and pale. What Harriet recorded from their conversation formed the heart of her husband's account. At first, grief kept Agatha from lighting the fire. The sight of the empty hearth was too much, a hollow reminder of what had been taken from her. The thought of flames flickering where her son had fallen was unbearable. The cold crept in, wrapping around her like a shroud, but even that seemed a lesser torment than the memories. Eventually the winter grew too cruel. Her hands trembled as she struck the match, the tiny flames sputtering in the frigid air. When the fire finally took, she felt its warmth push back the cold. But then, faintly, she heard a soft whisper. It was Thomas's voice. It sounded scared, frightened, but she couldn't make out the words. In her shock, she dropped the match onto the cold stone of the hearth, and it extinguished. The whispers stopped. She struck another match, listening intently for Thomas's whispers, but heard nothing. In a few moments she had a kindling fire. That's when the whispers came again, no longer soft, but insistent, carrying a weight that cut through the crackling wood. It sounded as though it came from somewhere deep within the chimney. She froze, her heart pounding, as the faint voice grew clearer, sharper, like it was straining to be heard. The fire's glow felt wrong now, its warmth suffocating, rather than soothing. As the flames grew, so did the sound, escalating from an urgent cry to a raw, visceral scream, echoing off the walls of the small, empty home. With heavy sobs, she alternated between trying to warm her hands on the fire or holding them over her ears to block out the screams. She was convinced she was going mad, that her grief was overwhelming her, and that the only way out of this hell was through. But then she saw the shadow, a dark figure, reaching down from the throat of the chimney, absorbing the light of the flames. It crawled downward, dragging itself along the stones of the hearth. Its form disintegrated with each jerky movement, crumbling like ash disturbed by a gust of wind. Soot streaked the stones in its wake. She ran from the house and waited outside, shivering, until the smoke stopped curling from her chimney. From that day forward, she hadn't dared to light the hearth again. Agatha, pale and shivering, recounted her experience in a disjointed rush, her voice barely rising above a whisper. Harriet listened, skeptical but uneasy, and resolved to light a fire despite Agatha's protests. The kindling caught quickly, and the flames roared to life, momentarily breaking the cold's grip on the room. For a moment, there was only the sound of crackling wood. Then Harriet thought she heard something, a faint scraping, like nails on stone, coming from the flue. She leaned closer, peering into the flickering glow, and her breath caught as she saw it. A hand, blackened and sooty, reaching downward with jerky, unnatural movements. In fright, Harriet ran from the house just as Agatha rushed forward, her face contorted in terror, to douse the flames with trembling hands. The clerk notes that his wife refused to ever return to the Bray house again. 3 days later, Agatha Bray was found dead in her home. Her body was discovered, slumped before the hearth, her hands blackened with soot. Kindling lay scattered around her, as though she had been preparing to light another fire. The details disturbed even the most stoic among the villagers. Agatha's mouth was smeared with soot, and when her body was moved, a fine black cloud erupted from her lips, spreading across the icy floor like ash from a long-dead flame. Additional records from this forgotten settlement note the peculiar tradition of hanging sturdy iron lanterns from their homes each winter. The practice, it seems, was diligently maintained until the village was abandoned, its last residents departing decades later. The following account originates from the leaked files of Dr. Arthur Morris, a psychiatrist arrested for gross misconduct. These records revealed involvement in occult practices related to his treatment of vulnerable patients. Among the documents seized was the file of a young woman, known only as Claire, whose case reveals a chilling intersection of trauma, dreams, and an unsettling devotion to something far beyond human understanding. Claire's file spanned a decade of sessions, beginning after the fire that consumed her childhood home and took her younger brother Daniel, a fire sparked by a dish towel she left too close to the stove. Desperate to ease her guilt, her parents placed her in treatment. At first, the therapy seemed to work. Dr. Morris's methods, as a psychiatrist specializing in trauma therapy, were gentle, even comforting, and her parents were encouraged by the progress they perceived in their daughter. Yet Morris's notes hinted at a design more insidious, a slow, deliberate shaping of her subconscious, deepening the roots of her guilt. Months into her treatment, Claire began having nightmares, as anticipated in Morris's notes. In these dreams, she relived the fire, the acrid scent of smoke, the roar of flames devouring the walls, and the suffocating darkness as she fumbled for an escape. She relived the dish towel left too close to the stove, the momentary lapse that sparked the blaze. She recalled screaming for Daniel as she scrambled out of the house, her legs frozen at the threshold, unable to force herself back inside. The dreams began the same way every time, a cruel, unchanging echo of her guilt. Dr. Morris encouraged Claire to share her dreams, claiming they were part of the healing process, but his notes revealed something else, meticulous records brimming with fascination at the depth of her subconscious. Over time, the dreams began to evolve. Claire started seeing flames that seemed alive, curling into strange sigils that burned themselves into the walls. She froze, staring at their shifting, unnatural shapes. But then, Daniel's screams, a sound she had never heard in her dreams before, pierced through the crackle of the fire. The noise jolted her awake in her bed, interrupting the dream. Dr. Morris noted the sigils with interest, calling them promising manifestations, though a note of frustration is evident as he notes the terrifying scream that interrupts her dreams. As the years progressed, Claire's dreams continued to grow more vivid. She continued to find herself stumbling through thick, suffocating smoke, her vision narrowing, panic clawing at her throat. Daniel's scream still echoed through the fire, a constant presence she could no longer separate from the dream itself. Through the haze, immense yellow eyes emerged, gleaming and fixed on her with an unnatural stillness. Their vastness defied logic, visible only because they loomed impossibly far away, as if peering from another plane. As the eyes pulled themselves toward her, a charred figure stepped into her path. Daniel, his presence sudden and jarring, breaking the moment's suffocating grip. He stood between her and the eyes, his gaze is not fixed, not on her, but on whatever loomed beyond the smoke. Dr. Morris noted the eyes with excitement, calling them evidence of deeper activity, though his notes carried a quiet impatience. Whatever process he was cultivating was taking longer than he had anticipated. By the time Claire had reached her late 20s, the dreams had only grown worse. Daniel's charred figure appeared more frequently now, his screams of pain a constant, drowning out all else, his presence inescapable. Claire relived the fire again and again, navigating through the suffocating smoke. She crashed through the kitchen window, landing hard on the cold pavement, glass biting into her skin as she gasped for air. She turned back, expecting to see the house consumed by flames, but instead a massive, gaping maw loomed behind it. The maw stretched endlessly, devouring everything in its path, an abyss swallowing the very fabric of the dream. It pulled at her, but just as the darkness threatened to engulf her, a charred hand seized her wrist, its grip like jagged hot coals. It was Daniel. She thrashed against him, convinced he was pulling her into the void, but his hold remained steady. The empty cavities where his eyes should have been seemed to bore into her soul. When she finally woke, her wrist ached, as though marked by his grip. Dr. Morris's notes took on an edge of frustration. His notes state his expectations for the process to have been completed by now. The dreams had deepened, expanded, yet she was being held back. She remained resilient, her will intact, despite the progression he had so carefully orchestrated. Dr. Morris proposed a ritual as a means of helping her let go, to sever what he described as Daniel's lingering hold on her mind. He framed it as a necessary step toward healing, a way to free herself from the past. To Morris's satisfaction, she agreed. The notes of Claire's final visit with Morris begin with his shock at her presence. He had expected the process to be complete. Instead, she sat across from him, whole, recounting her final dream. She had followed his instructions precisely, arranging the prescribed items, a scorched photograph of Daniel, a silver pendant, a jar of rainwater. Candles flickered around her room, casting restless shadows as she prepared to sleep. As sleep took her, Claire drifted into the familiar dream, as expected. The fire roared around her, the air thick with smoke and the acrid scent of burning wood. There was no sign of Daniel, no screams, no charred figure. She clutched the photograph tightly, her knuckles white against its scorched edges. Standing before the flames, she hesitated, the heat pressing against her skin. Trusting Morris's instructions, she dropped the photograph into the fire. As its edges blackened and curled, the world around her began to change. The walls groaned, twisting and warping, as though some unseen force had been awakened. The air thickened, pressing against her chest, and the flickering candlelight dimmed into an unnatural gloom. The familiar scenes of her burning home unraveled, the fabric of the dream tearing apart to reveal a terrifying dreamscape before her. Pulsating walls oozed with viscous liquid, and jagged, spire-like structures jutted into a blood-red sky. Fleshy tendrils and rusty spires jutted from the ground around her. She turned, and that's when she saw it, a towering presence, its vast form blending with the fractured sky. It was watching her. The entity was impossibly vast, its sheer size defying comprehension. Horned and hunched, its grotesque form was a twisted amalgamation of flesh, bone, and rusted metal that blended into the dreamscape. Tendrils stretched from its back, spreading into the distance, weaving through the warped fabric of the dream. Through a haze of distorted space, Claire saw where they led: hospital beds, dimly lit rooms, and shadowed corners of hospice wards. Each tendril was linked to a comatose figure, their bodies twitching, their faces contorted in silent torment as nightmares pulsed from them into the massive creature. Its vast glowing eyes locked onto her, siphoning the life from her very soul. Claire's knees buckled under the weight of its presence. But then, flames surged next to Claire, roaring to life in a sudden, violent burst. Through the inferno, Daniel emerged, his charred figure wreathed in fire that did not consume him. The flames danced unnaturally around him, clinging to him, pushing back the darkness. His eyeless gaze focused on Claire, and he spoke, his voice rasping but sure. "I'm here," he said. "For you." Before Claire could react, tendrils from the entity lashed toward her. Daniel stepped in, fire surging as he burned them to ash, but more followed. She realized he was protecting her, but he couldn't hold them back forever. Claire looked at the fire at her feet. The photograph smoldered in the embers, half consumed. She hesitated, then reached in, grasping its scorched edges, and pulled it free. As she did, the nightmare world trembled, cracks forming in its distorted sky as the dream faded away. After recounting her experience, Claire informed Dr. Morris that she decided to end treatment. Though the nightmares still haunt her, she had decided to stop running from them. They are a part of her, and a memory of Daniel. Dr. Morris's final note in her file is written in jagged, furious strokes, ink pressed deep into the page. She was meant to be the perfect offering, a feast of nightmarish terror, yet at the precipice she denied it, denied me. The nightmares I nurtured, she has embraced them, accepted them. Very well. Let them be her salvation and her burden. Claire vanished from the record after that appointment, but those who studied the case agree on one thing. The nightmares never stopped. Whether they were her prison or her shield, only Claire would know.